Translate this, and my salary is yours. The voice was a shard of glass in the vast, echoing silence of the marble lobby. Elias Vance did not look up, his attention fixed on a stubborn scuff mark marring the perfect polish of the floor. His hands, accustomed to the worn wood of his mop handle, moved with a steady, practiced economy. The scent of sterile cleaning fluid was the scent of his survival, a chemical veil he wore every day. Beside his rolling yellow cart, a small figure sat on a discarded newspaper, a worn unicorn clutched in her lap. Lily, his 7-year-old world, was coloring, her tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth in concentration. A fever had closed her school and, with no one else to call, she was his silent partner for the night shift, a small, warm presence in the cold cathedral of commerce. The voice sliced through the quiet again, louder this time, dripping with arrogance. I'm talking to you. The help, a man in a suit so sharp it could cut paper, Marcus Thorne, vice president of acquisitions, gestured with a tablet toward a huddle of anxious-looking foreign investors. My translator is stuck in traffic. This is a billion-dollar deal. You look worldly. You must speak something other than silence. Elias felt the familiar clench in his gut, the instinct to become smaller, to blend into the gleaming surfaces he was paid to maintain. He kept his eyes down, his knuckles white on the mop handle. A door hissed open on the mezzanine above, a sound swallowed by the cavernous space. Genevieve Sterling, CEO and architect of this steel and glass empire, stood silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the city. She was a figure of unflinching control, her presence a drop in temperature. She surveyed the scene below, her expression a mask of cold neutrality. Her gaze swept over the investors, over Marcus's preening display, and for a fleeting, dismissive moment, over the janitor and his child. I am making a point, Genevieve, Marcus called up to her, his voice performative. That our systems are fallible. That we are reliant on the flimsy infrastructure of this city. His gaze landed back on Elias, a predator enjoying its sport. But perhaps we have hidden assets. He turned fully to Elias, his voice laced with the kind of cruel amusement reserved for those he considered less than human. Come on. One sentence. Surely you can manage that. The pressure in the room became a physical weight. The investors murmured, their confusion turning to irritation. Genevieve's silence from the mezzanine was an indictment in itself. It was this silence, this absolute void of intervention, that finally broke through the carefully constructed peace of Lily's world. The sharp, angry tone of Marcus's voice, the palpable tension radiating from the adults, was too much. The crayon fell from her hand. Her own small world, a fragile bubble of safety Elias built for her each day, had been pierced. A small whimper escaped her lips, then another. Her shoulders began to shake, her breath catching in hiccuping sobs as a sensory overload began to crest. The sound shattered the corporate standoff. Every head turned toward the small, crying child. Marcus looked annoyed, his game spoiled. The investors looked uncomfortable. Genevieve, on the mezzanine, flinched. It was a minuscule reaction, a slight tightening of her jaw, but it was there. Elias moved. The world of investors and insults and billion-dollar deals vanished. There was only Lily. He dropped the mop. It clattered loudly on the marble. In one smooth motion, he was on his knees in front of her, his large frame a shield between her and the cold stares of the room. He didn't speak. He didn't try to reason with her rising panic. His hands, calloused and gentle, found hers. He met her tear-filled eyes, his own gaze an anchor of unwavering calm. He began to hum, a low, resonant sound from deep in his chest. Then, words followed the melody. They were not English. They were not Spanish or any language the investors, a polyglot group, could recognize. The syllables were soft, ancient, flowing like water over smooth stones. It was a lullaby, a forgotten dialect from a mountain region he had studied years ago, chosen for its unique phonetic properties, a cadence scientifically proven to soothe the frayed nerves of the human limbic system. It was an act of pure, intuitive empathy, a key forged in love and knowledge, turning the lock of his daughter's fear. Lily's sobs softened, her breathing slowly syncing with the rhythmic cadence of his voice. She leaned her forehead against his, her small hands gripping his fingers. The storm inside her subsided, leaving only the quiet safety of her father's presence. The silence that returned to the lobby was different. It was no longer cold and empty. It was filled with the lingering echo of a profound and gentle power. From the mezzanine, Genevieve Sterling watched. She had not moved. Her hand was now pressed lightly against her lips, her knuckles pale. She had witnessed boardroom takedowns, hostile negotiations, and corporate betrayals that would curdle blood. None of it had ever shaken her. But this quiet, instantaneous act of grace, a man using what sounded like a dead language to heal his child's unseen wound, it struck a chord deep within her, a place she thought had long since turned to stone. It was a form of power she had never encountered, not leveraged, not asserted, but given. Freely. She saw his worn-out boots, the faded fabric of his uniform, and the absolute, unconditional love that radiated from him, a warmth she could feel even from 50 feet away. It was an anomaly that her ruthlessly logical mind could not process. Her composure, her greatest asset, fractured. She turned from the railing, her movements stiff, and descended the grand, sterile staircase. Her sharp heels clicked on the marble, a sound that announced the return of order. The investors straightened. Marcus's smugness faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Elias, still kneeling, heard the footsteps approach and finally looked up, his expression guarded, shielding his daughter behind him. Genevieve stopped a few feet away. Her corporate authority was a palpable force field, yet her eyes were fixed on him with a raw, unnerving curiosity. The cold mask was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous: vulnerability. She held out a single, thin file folder. "I have a series of letters," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the immense weight of her position. "From a defunct mining company in the Ural Mountains. Written in a Komi-Permiak dialect no one at any university or agency we've hired can decipher." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "I will pay you 10 times what they were offering." The offer hung in the air, a bridge between two impossibly different worlds. It was not a question of ambition or money. It was a test. And for the first time in a decade, Genevieve Sterling had no idea what the answer would be. Elias was hesitant. His life was a carefully balanced equation of survival and fatherhood. Any new variable was a risk. He looked from Genevieve's piercing gaze to Lily, who was now quietly nestled against his side, safe. He saw the fatigue in his daughter's eyes, the paleness of her cheeks from the fever. He thought of the leaking pipe in their small apartment, the ever-present stack of bills. 10 times the rate of a top-tier translator was more than his yearly salary. It was a foothold. It was security. For Lily. His decision was not about reclaiming a past life, but about protecting his present one. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. He would not enter her world, not really. He would stand at the edge, do the work, and retreat back to the only world that mattered. He started the next day, not in the gleaming tower, but in a forgotten storage room in the building's basement, repurposed into a makeshift office. It smelled of old paper and dust, a scent he found strangely comforting after the sterile air of the lobby. A simple desk, a lamp, and a banker's box containing the letters were his new domain. It was a liminal space, neither part of the janitorial world nor the corporate one. It was perfect. Marcus Thorne made a point of visiting on the first afternoon. He leaned against the doorframe, a smirk playing on his lips, looking at Elias as if he were an exotic insect. "The great linguist," Marcus began, his voice dripping with condescension. "Hiding his light under a bushel of, well, trash. Tell me, Vance, what other hidden talents do you possess? Can you fix the coffee machine with a song, too?" Elias didn't respond. He was focused on the first letter, its brittle, yellowed paper covered in a script that was as much art as language. He had seen it before, in dusty academic journals. Marcus was just noise, a distraction from the intricate puzzle before him. "She's making a mistake," Marcus continued, his tone turning sharp. Bringing someone like you into the fold. It shows weakness. Sentimentality. He pushed off the door frame. Don't get comfortable. The threat was clear, but it was hollow. Elias's world was not this office, not this company. His world was a 7-year-old girl who needed him home for dinner. His comfort had nothing to do with this place. But Genevieve had given him access. He had a security card that opened doors he used to only ever clean. As he moved through the building on his designated breaks, his janitorial instincts kicked in. He noticed things. The persistent squeak of a hinge on the door to the legal department that made the executive assistant wince every time it opened. The disorganized chaos of the historical archives, a vital resource for patent defense, left in a state of near unusable clutter. He saw the subtle frictions that slowed the great machine of Sterling Industries, the small annoyances that wore people down. And quietly, without being asked, he fixed them. A drop of oil from his own small toolkit silenced the hinge. An hour of his lunch break was spent rearranging a section of the archive, not alphabetically, but chronologically and by project code name, a far more intuitive system. He did it because it was in his nature to bring order from chaos, to make things work better. Genevieve noticed. She didn't see him do these things, but she saw the results. Her assistant mentioned the door, her relief palpable. A junior lawyer praised the miraculous reorganization of the archives that had saved him a week of work. Small reports, anecdotal evidence of a quiet competence, a gentle hand bringing order to her world. She would walk past his basement office late at night and see the warm, soft light from his lamp spilling out from under the door, a beacon of steady, focused work in the silent building. The intrigue she felt in the lobby deepened, settling into a quiet respect. This man didn't operate on the same frequency as the rest of her world. He wasn't motivated by status or ambition. He was motivated by something else, something she couldn't yet name, but recognized as fundamentally more real than anything in her life. He was not just an anomaly, he was a constant, a force of quiet integrity in her sterile kingdom, and she found herself wanting to understand the source of his power. The breakthrough came on a Thursday night, during a week when a hostile takeover bid had sent the entire top floor into a state of managed panic. Genevieve was working late, fueled by black coffee and sheer force of will. The building was a tomb, silent and still. Restless, she left her penthouse office and walked the empty halls, the rhythmic click of her heels the only sound. On a whim, she took the service elevator to the basement, drawn to the sliver of light from under his door. She had intended to just pass by, but she heard him speaking. She stopped, pressing her ear lightly to the cold steel of the door. It wasn't one voice. It was several. He was speaking in the Komi-Permiak dialect of the letters, his tone questioning, speculative. Then the language shifted, flowing seamlessly into German, then Mandarin, then a fluid academic French. He was debating himself, cross-referencing concepts across linguistic and cultural barriers. He wasn't translating the words, he was inhabiting the mind of the man who wrote them a century ago. His desk, she knew without seeing, wouldn't just hold the letters. It would be a constellation of maps, historical texts, and technical manuals, a universe of context he built to find a single, unvarnished truth. Quietly, she pushed the door open a crack. The sight stopped her breath. Elias was at the desk, illuminated by the single warm lamp, his back to her. He was completely absorbed, his left hand tracing the lines of an old geological survey map, while his right made notes in a worn leather-bound journal. He murmured a phrase in Russian, then paused, tilted his head, and restated it in a lyrical Arabic, finding a nuance in the second language that the first had lacked. It was a performance for an audience of one, an act of pure, soulful immersion. This was not a skill, it was a gift. It was the private, unguarded ritual of a master at his craft. She was seeing the part of him he had put away for the sake of survival, the genius he held in exile. He must have sensed her presence. He fell silent, his shoulders tensing. Slowly he turned. His eyes were not the guarded eyes of the janitor, but the deep, weary eyes of a scholar pulled from his work. There was no embarrassment in them, only a quiet dignity. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the dusty room. The vast gulf between the CEO and the janitor collapsed into nothing. In its place, a fragile thread of shared intimacy began to form, a silent acknowledgement of the hidden depths within them both. He had seen past her power, and now, she had seen past his poverty. She saw the man, not the uniform. And for the first time, she felt a bond that wasn't based on a transaction, but on a moment of genuine, breathtaking revelation. She simply nodded, a gesture of profound respect, and quietly closed the door, leaving him to his work, her own world irrevocably altered. A few days later, Genevieve found herself descending to the basement again, this time with a specific purpose. She needed to review his progress, a perfectly valid corporate reason, but it was a pretense. She was drawn by the memory of his intellectual fire, a stark contrast to the cold ambition that surrounded her daily. She found the door slightly ajar, and this time, the sound was not of ancient languages, but of a child's quiet humming. Peeking inside, she saw Lily sitting on the floor, a small box of crayons and a pad of paper her entire world. Elias was at his desk, speaking softly into a small digital recorder, translating one of the letters in a clear, even tone. The scene was one of peaceful, domestic industry. It was so foreign to her own life, so completely devoid of tension or performance, that she felt like an intruder from another planet. Lily looked up and saw her standing in the doorway. The little girl didn't show any fear, only a child's open curiosity. She smiled, a bright, gap-toothed gesture that felt like a ray of sunlight in the dim basement. Genevieve found herself smiling back, a faint, amused expression. "Hello?" Genevieve said, her voice softer than she intended. Elias stopped the recording and turned. "Miss Sterling. I'm sorry. Her after-school program had a plumbing issue." "It's fine," Genevieve said, her eyes on Lily. "She's not a disturbance." Lily got to her feet and walked over to Genevieve, her movements serious and deliberate. She held up the piece of paper she had been working on. It was a drawing, rendered in the bold, unsteady lines of a 7-year-old. It depicted a tall woman with striking black hair, wearing a dress made of what looked like gold foil from a candy wrapper, carefully glued to the paper. The woman in the drawing wore a crown. But above her head, Lily had drawn a large, swirling cloud of gray and black crayon, heavy and menacing. Genevieve accepted the drawing, her fingers brushing Lily's. The paper was warm. She stared at the image of herself, the queen in her tower, powerful and untouchable, yet shadowed by an immense, dark storm that only a child had been able to see. "Thank you, Lily. It's very good." Lily looked up at her, her gaze unnervingly direct. She didn't comment on the drawing. Instead, she delivered a simple, profound observation, a truth bomb that landed with the force of a physical blow. "You have sad eyes," she said, her voice clear and without judgment. The words echoed in the small room. Elias froze, a protective instinct rising in him. But Genevieve didn't react with anger or offense. She simply stared at the child. For decades, people had looked at her and seen power, wealth, ambition, or a threat. No one had ever truly seen her. No one had looked past the fortress she had built and noticed the prisoner inside. This small child, with a crayon and an honest heart, had seen it in an instant. A crack formed in her armor, not from an attack, but from an act of guileless perception. She felt seen, truly and completely, in a way that left her breathless. She looked down at the drawing in her hand, the gold crown and the storm cloud. It was the most honest portrait she had ever received. A simple, profound gift that was worth more than any corporate asset. She couldn't speak. She just nodded at Lily, a gesture of gratitude, and retreated, the drawing held carefully in her hands, her carefully ordered world beginning to tilt on its axis. The rain started that evening, a soft, persistent drizzle that blurred the city lights into a watercolor wash. It matched the turmoil inside Genevieve. Lily's words, "You have sad eyes," echoed in her mind, a simple key turning a lock she'd forgotten existed. She found herself on the building's hidden rooftop terrace, a small, forgotten pocket of green amidst the steel and concrete, letting the cool mist settle on her face. She wasn't surprised when she heard the door open behind her. Elias stepped out, holding a forgotten file she'd left in his office. He stopped when he saw her. The space was intimate, enclosed by planters of sleeping hostas and the low wall overlooking the city. The usual barriers of their positions felt irrelevant up here, washed away by the rain. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said, his voice a low rumble against the sound of the storm. "You're not," she replied, not turning to look at him. She stared out at the sprawling, illuminated grid below. "She's very perceptive, your daughter." A long silence settled between them, comfortable and freighted with unspoken meaning. The rain was a gentle curtain, granting them a moment of privacy from the world. "Her mother was like that," Elias said finally, his voice thick with a quiet grief that was years old but still present. "Sarah could walk into a room and know who was hurting, who was pretending. She was a psychologist. She said most people just want to be seen. Really seen." It was an opening, a vulnerable admission. Genevieve felt compelled to meet it. She turned to face him, the rain plastering a strand of dark hair to her cheek. "And how did she die?" The question was blunt, a probe into the heart of his core wound, but her tone was not clinical. It was raw. Elias's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "Car accident. A drunk driver ran a red light. She was on her way to pick Lily up from daycare. I was in Berlin at a conference, presenting a paper on proto-uralic verb structures." His voice was flat, stripped of all emotion, a recitation of a fact that had cleaved his life in two. "By the time I got home, my whole world was gone. I had a choice. Tenure at the university, a life of travel and research, or Lily. It was never a choice." He looked down at his hands, the hands of a janitor, not a professor. "I had to be present. I couldn't outsource her grief. Or mine." The confession hung in the air between them, simple, profound, and devastating. He had chosen exile. He had sacrificed his own potential not as a tragedy, but as a necessary act of love. Genevieve understood. His quiet strength, his unwavering focus on his daughter, it was all rooted in this immense loss. She felt a sudden, sharp need to be just as honest, to lower her own shield. "My father," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "never told me he loved me. Not once. He was a builder. He respected things that were solid, things that produced results. Buildings. Profits. Me." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "He would review my report cards like a stock portfolio." And it got a nod. An A+ got a rare, thin smile. Love was transactional. Approval had to be earned, every single day. The day I closed my first major deal, bigger than any of his, he took me to dinner. He raised a glass and said, "You're not a liability anymore." She finally looked at Elias, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, the rain on her face a convenient disguise. "I learned early that my feelings were a liability. Vulnerability was a flaw in the design. So I eliminated it. I built this company, this life, to be perfectly designed. Strong. Unflinching. Sterile." She looked around at the city, at the monuments to power, her power. Hollow. In the quiet space of that rooftop garden, surrounded by the gentle rain, two souls laid down their armor. He, the man who gave up a world of prestige for love, and she, the woman who gave up love for a world of prestige. They were no longer the CEO and the janitor. They were simply Genevieve and Elias, two people who had finally been seen. The exchange of their deepest wounds forged a bond far stronger than shared intimacy or mutual respect. It was the quiet, dawning recognition of a soulmate. The shift in their dynamic did not go unnoticed. Marcus Thorne watched Genevieve's interactions with Elias with a growing sense of alarm. He saw the way she sought him out, the way she listened to his opinion on matters far outside the scope of his translation work. He saw the drawing Lily had made taped to the wall beside Genevieve's billion-dollar stock ticker. To Marcus, this wasn't a burgeoning connection, it was a threat to the established order, a lapse in judgment that made the company, and his own position, vulnerable. He couldn't attack Elias's work. The translated letters had already uncovered a hidden mineral rights clause worth hundreds of millions, so he decided to attack the man himself. He did it with the cold, calculated precision of a corporate raider. He hired a private investigator, a grubby man who specialized in finding leverage. The findings were meager. Elias Vance was a man of impeccable character. But he was poor. And poor men were easy targets. The investigator found one instance, 2 weeks prior, where Elias, delayed by a last-minute request from Genevieve, had been 20 minutes late picking Lily up from her after-school program. It was nothing. A footnote. But in the hands of a man like Marcus, it could be fashioned into a weapon. The call was made anonymously. A concerned citizen, reporting a case of potential neglect. A father keeping his sick child in a corporate basement. A man who was consistently late, leaving his young daughter waiting, a sign of instability. It was a masterpiece of malicious insinuation, crafted to trigger an automatic, bureaucratic response. 2 days later, a sober-faced woman from Child Protective Services appeared at the door of Elias's small apartment. She was polite, professional, but her presence was a violation, a primal threat that struck at the very core of Elias's identity. The thought of losing Lily, of having his love for her questioned and judged by strangers, was a terror beyond anything he had ever known. The investigation was an external manifestation of his deepest fear, that in trying to be everything for his daughter, he would somehow fail her. The world he had so carefully constructed around her, a world of safety and love, was suddenly under siege. When the news reached Genevieve, it was via a sanitized email from her legal department, advising her to terminate Elias's contract immediately to distance the company from a potential scandal. The board of directors echoed the sentiment in a series of curt, panicked calls. Protect the brand. Minimize liability. Cut the cord. It was the logic she had lived by her entire life. It was the advice she herself would have given a month ago. But as she read the email, a cold fury ignited within her, burning away the last vestiges of her old self. This wasn't a corporate problem. This was an attack on Elias. It was an attack on Lily. It was an attack on the one pure, good thing that had entered her life. The choice was laid bare before her, stark and absolute: protect her old world, the sterile, powerful empire she had built, or protect her new one, which consisted of a quiet man and his wonderful daughter. The choice to protect her company's image, or to protect its soul. It was never a choice. She stood up from her desk, the email still glowing on her screen. She picked up her phone, but she didn't call the legal department. She called her personal security chief, a man whose loyalty was to her, not the company. "I want to know who initiated the CPS report against Elias Vance," she said, her voice like ice. "Use any means necessary. I want a name." Then she walked out of her office, past her stunned assistant, and took the elevator down. Not to the basement, but to the lobby. She walked straight to Elias, who was standing near the entrance, waiting for his lawyer, his face a mask of pale, controlled anguish. She didn't say a word. She simply stood beside him, a silent, unwavering presence. When he looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate fear, she met his gaze and gave a small, firm shake of her head. It was a promise. "You are not alone." In that moment, they ceased to be two individuals drawn together by circumstance. They became an alliance. She was no longer a queen in a glass tower, observing from above. She was on the ground, in the trenches, and she was ready to burn her own kingdom down to protect him. The climax arrived not in a courtroom, but in a sterile, wood-paneled conference room for a formal CPS review hearing. The air was thick with a tense, bureaucratic quiet. Elias sat at one side of a long mahogany table, his pro bono lawyer, a sharp young woman hired by Genevieve, beside him. On the other side sat the CPS case worker and her supervisor. And at the far end, in a chair he had inserted himself into, was Marcus Thorne, his face a mask of sanctimonious concern for the child's welfare. Genevieve entered last. She didn't sit with Elias. She stood at the head of the table, a position of command. She placed a thin leather portfolio in the center of the table. "Before you begin," she said, her voice calm and lethally precise, "I believe there is some context you require." The supervisor, a weary woman named Mrs. Davies, looked up. "Miss Sterling, this is a confidential review." "It stopped being confidential," Genevieve cut in, her eyes locking onto Marcus, "when it became a weapon in a corporate power play." She opened the portfolio. "This is the file from the private investigator hired by Mr. Thorne. In it you will find evidence of him stalking Mr. Vance, looking for any pretext to create this situation. You will also find a sworn affidavit from my security chief, including audio logs, tracing the anonymous tip directly to a burner phone purchased by Mr. Thorne last Tuesday." Marcus's color drained away. He started to stammer, to object, but Genevieve didn't give him the space. She slid another set of documents across the table. "And this is a character portfolio for Elias Vance. It includes letters of commendation from his neighbors, from every one of Lily's teachers, from the director of her after-school program, who notes that Mr. Vance is a model parent, and from 24 employees at my company who have written, unsolicited, to praise his kindness, his integrity, and his quiet dedication. There is even a note from my executive assistant, thanking him for fixing a squeaky hinge on her door because he noticed it was causing her stress." She paused, letting the weight of the evidence settle in the room. Then, she looked at Elias, her expression softening for just a fraction of a second before turning back to the panel. "Mr. Vance's work for me required him to stay late on one occasion. The occasion you have cited as neglect. He was working to secure this company a 9-figure asset that would protect the jobs of over 5,000 employees. He did so, reluctantly, only after I assured him his daughter would be safe and cared for. The failure on that day was mine, for putting him in that position. The integrity was his." Finally, Elias spoke. His voice was not angry or defensive. It was filled with a quiet, unshakable dignity. "My daughter is my life," he said simply, looking directly at Mrs. Davies. "Everything I do, every floor I mop, every word I translate is for her. To give her a safe and happy home. That is my only purpose." The truth of his words was absolute, undeniable. Mrs. Davies looked from the mountain of evidence to Marcus's ashen, guilty face, and then to the quiet, dignified man before her. She closed the file. "I see no evidence of neglect. In fact, I see evidence of extraordinary parenting under difficult circumstances. This case is closed." A collective sigh of relief filled the room. But Genevieve wasn't finished. She turned her full attention to Marcus, her voice dropping to a low, glacial tone. "You used the child's welfare as a corporate tactic. You weaponized a system designed to protect the innocent to settle a petty, pathetic grievance. You are a liability, Marcus. Not because you are sentimental, but because you have no soul." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Your employment at Sterling Industries is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building." In the stunned silence that followed, as the defeated Marcus was led away, Genevieve walked over to Elias. In front of the lawyers, in front of the CPS workers, she reached out and took his hand. His fingers wrapped around hers, a firm, grounding pressure. It was a simple gesture, but in the context of that room, it was a public declaration. They were a unit. A team. They had faced the fire together, and they had won. Her empire had a new foundation, and it was built on the quiet integrity of the man standing beside her. That evening, the city was clear and brilliant, the rain having washed the sky clean. They stood on the rooftop garden once more, the place where they had first shared their truths. The silence between them was different now, stripped of all barriers, filled with the peaceful exhaustion of a battle won. "I'm restructuring," Genevieve said, looking out at the skyline that had once been her only companion. "I'm creating a new department. The Department of Intercultural Strategy. It's not just about translation. It's about understanding. Context. Empathy." She turned to him. "I want you to run it." It was the offer of a lifetime. A reclamation of the world he had left behind, but on his own terms. But Elias wasn't looking at the city, or thinking about the job. He was looking at her. He saw the woman who had torn down her own walls to defend him. He saw the strength she wielded not for power, but for protection. He saw the sadness in her eyes finally beginning to recede, replaced by a tentative, hopeful light. He stepped forward, closing the small space between them. The years of grief, of self-imposed exile, of believing his life was only about survival, fell away. He was no longer just a father, a widower, a janitor. He was a man worthy of being seen, worthy of this new, terrifying, beautiful feeling. He gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. Then, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or desperation. It was a kiss of arrival. It was gentle, certain, and profoundly earned. A promise of a new beginning, high above the city that had, against all odds, brought them together. 1 year later. Sunlight streamed through the large windows of a home that was a perfect fusion of their two worlds, clean, modern lines filled with the warmth of worn wood, cluttered bookshelves, and Lily's vibrant artwork. Genevieve, dressed in soft jeans and a simple sweater, laughed as Lily, now 8, chased a soccer ball across a lush green lawn. Elias stood on the patio, a mug of coffee in his hand, watching them. The hollow ache that had been his constant companion for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady joy. Their joint venture, the Sarah Vance Foundation for Intercultural Empathy, was launching today. Funded by a substantial endowment from Sterling Industries, its mission was to provide free, context-rich translation and cultural advocacy for refugee families, and to sponsor scholarships for gifted linguists from underprivileged backgrounds. It was a legacy for his late wife, and a new purpose for them both. It was work that healed. Genevieve walked up to him, her face glowing with a happiness he never would have thought possible the day he first saw her on the mezzanine. She wrapped her arms around his waist and leaned her head against his chest, right over his heart. He rested his chin on the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair. They watched their daughter, their brilliant, perceptive Lily, who had seen the truth in them both and built the bridge for their souls to cross. They had started as a queen and a janitor, isolated in their separate towers of power and grief. Now they were simply a family, rooted in a life they had built together, a life of connection and purpose. They had found their way home. Where are you watching from? From a bustling city or a quiet town, we hope this story found you well. If this story touched your heart, please like and comment below to let us know. Your support allows us to keep creating. Thank you for spending your time with us. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and never stop looking for the goodness in others.